Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill, a wild Saturday of college football, which is reflected in a wild shakeup of the Rock Boys top 25. I think I have a few hot takes in these top 25 rankings. I think the thing that sticks out to me when I was building this out is Dill, Texas, Ohio State, like solo top contenders for me as we stand. And I think it starts with you look at Texas and Ohio State and say, where are the question marks? Where are the holes in these two teams? Yeah, they haven't necessarily been tested like some of these other teams, but when I watch them play, like there are no question marks about what these teams have. And I think they have the top end talent to be some of the best teams in all of college football. You look at that next tier and say, you can kind of nitpick and find some holes in some of those teams. Few other storylines kind of right off the top. Really low in the Big 12. I think I made that clear yesterday. I'm going to continue double down on that stance. I was doing some work with the Big 12 this morning, and it's just like I don't think the Big 12 is all that good. And when you see the Big 12 play out of conference games, they don't look very good. I'm not buying on Iowa State as the 11th best team in the country like the AP poll has. I get the resume solid, but when your best win is a 1-point win against Iowa, I ain't going to believe in you. And then the Washington Huskies. And I don't think this is an overreaction just because they beat Michigan. Dill, this Washington team's been good. And we'll get into Washington as we kind of work through these rankings. Fired up to get into it. Now, before we do it, as always, and most importantly, let it fly in the comment section. A lot of hot takes from the kid. I know many of you guys have some problems. That's the beauty of doing these top 25. So would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, without further ado, let's get into this. And I would like to get your take on Texas, Ohio State, that solo tier 1 in college football.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that as well. I think Penn State's probably the only team that hasn't shown a glaring weakness in a sense. But I'm looking at Penn State like, do they have the top end guys? Because the past couple of years, they really haven't had that. When they go up against the big dogs, they have obviously struggled. So I think, again, you look Texas, Ohio State, they've proved it. They've beaten big-time teams pretty consistently for the last couple of years. Penn State probably still needs to prove it. And then you look, Oregon offensive line hasn't looked what you want it to look like. It's starting to get rolling a little bit for sure. But again, when you've had a couple games now where you're like, man, they don't look what they're supposed to be, I'm comfortable there. And then Miami and Tennessee, obviously Nico at Tennessee, not a great game against Arkansas. Definitely gives you some questions. And then the Miami secondary has had some real weak moments. So I'm comfortable. You look, those two teams, every game they've played, been very, very dominant. Again, haven't really had chances to stub their toes, but they've been lights out.
And the storyline for me with Texas and Ohio State, like everybody wants to talk about their offenses. Like they have legitimate star power. Like I think Texas's offensive line is probably the best unit in the country. I think Quinn Ewers, although a small sample size, has clearly taken that step in 2024. And I can't wait to see when he comes back healthy. And then Ohio State, like these are two of the top 5 defenses in the country, not only statistically, but at least in my opinion.
I will say, I think you might be a little high on Texas defense. And that's why I think, like, I don't think it's totally clear that Ohio State's not the best team in the country. Like, do I like
100%
a little bit more? Yeah, definitely. I think the quarterback plays much better. I think the offensive line plays quite a bit better. But Ohio State, I'm pretty convinced has the best defense in the country right now, top to bottom. I think the linebacker play is coming along. Simon is playing at a really high level, so that's helping out a lot. I think they're just different flavors. If you love really good offenses, you love Texas. If you love really good defenses, you love Ohio State. So I think those two teams, it is not clear to me at all who is that number one.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. And we kind of said this heading into 2024, like Ohio State from a roster standpoint, this is about as talented of a college football roster as we've seen in a very long time, specifically on defense. And then the emergence of a guy like Jeremiah Smith, who I think might be a top 10 wide receiver in the country at this point. A lot of firepower to Ohio State. Dill, I kind of agree with what you said with Penn State. Like where are the holes on Penn State? Not really any holes. I'm just kind of in the wait and see mode in terms of what Penn State looks like when they play elite caliber teams. Now, the thing that stands out with me with Penn State, the offense is significantly more explosive. They're running the football effectively, but they're also being explosive running the football, and then they're pushing the ball down the field. Like Coach Koldnicki, that was one of the more underrated offensive coordinator hires that we saw in all of college football. You go back to 2023, limited pre-snap motion, just a vanilla offense that when they played elite defenses, just couldn't scheme up explosives. Like Coach Koldnicki can do that for this Penn State team. I'm just kind of
– and that's why I'm comfortable kind of having them at 3. I think that a lot of people are going to disagree with that and even look as far out as a Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. Like, does the top end of Penn State have what it takes to go deal with the top end? Like those guys on Tennessee, Bama, Georgia, even Miami and Oregon, like I think they arguably have a little bit more top end talent, at least on paper. But again, you see how clean Penn State's playing, how much better their offense has been, and how much better Drew Allar's been, I think. Gives me enough confidence to put them at 3, but I certainly could see the argument from probably everyone up till Clemson saying, well, they just haven't had their chance to stub their toe like the rest of us had.
Yeah, Oregon, they look pretty complete. Like the last 2 games, and again, like some of the early performances may be lingering in the back of my mind. We're going to get our answer to Oregon real quick on Saturday night. Dill, Miami, I think you nailed it. Like with Cam Ward as their quarterback, I think they're legitimate contenders. I think Cam Ward's playing like the best quarterback in the country. And although it was a bad first half, that kid did not get rattled, came back and just stepped on Cal's throat in the second half. Getting into Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, like I grouped them up and I have Tennessee as that top team, but they all have like, I wouldn't say glaring weaknesses, but they have weaknesses on their football teams, right? You look at Tennessee. This was the first time that Nico was asked to really be a difference maker at the quarterback position. And for lack of better terms, didn't really show up. I saw some Tennessee fans in the comments section calling Nico, do we just see Joe Milton out there, which is criminally offensive. I think Nico is much better than Joe Milton. That being said, this Tennessee team didn't need to do much against Oklahoma on offense because of how good their defense was. Did not need to do much against NC State just because NC State flat out stinks and we missed on them. When he was asked to go win a football game, he really didn't. And so that's my biggest concern.
This is probably my biggest point of contention. I think I'd have Tennessee 3 or 4 personally. I think I'm not ready to
want to see more from Nico though?
100% want to see more. But again, that team around him is really complete. And frankly, I thought they played really poorly around Nico as well. So again, he didn't look his best for sure. I thought his wide receivers and tight ends could have bailed him out in a couple spots and make big time catches in some of those contested balls or a low ball that Squirrel White, I think, could have had. Like those type of things I think you wish your playmakers would have had. But at the end of the day, like the amount of false starts they had, roughing or running into the punter or whatever, that like giving that type of first down, like those things all kind of added up. And that's a good Arkansas team. That talk about a crime. You not having them as a top 25 team, crime. They didn't make any mistakes. They played really, really well.
Yeah.
I still think Tennessee's a really dangerous team. And I look like, can those other teams kind of match their physicality? Because that's probably where my physicality, speed, all
but
that.
The thing, like I'm totally with you. Like going into that game against Arkansas, Tennessee was our number 4 team in the country. We were both banging the table for this team. For me, like when I'm looking at the best teams in the country, like give me the quarterbacks that I can trust. And as of right now, I trust Dylan Gabriel more. I trust Cam Ward more. That's kind of where I sit. Alabama, I don't even know what to say about the loss to Vanderbilt. Shout out Vanderbilt. That's a better Vanderbilt team than we're used to seeing. This Alabama team on defense was an absolute disaster. Like Kane Womack, it's almost as if he didn't watch any film on Vanderbilt and just trotted out the defense. Disaster. That offense to me is still, I think, the best offense in the country. Like Jalen Milroe's playing at a really high level. They couldn't really get to the run game because they went down so much early and kind of just always felt like they needed to score quick. But you have big concerns about the Alabama defense now because this is 6 quarters of football now that they've been really, really bad, right? They were horrible all game against Vanderbilt. They were really bad in the second half against Georgia. You got a really young secondary that makes some flashy plays, but they're not always that consistent. And when you're giving up some of those explosive plays, like it's certainly a hole. And then secondly, Dill, like watching that game back, Alabama Vanderbilt, and I'll be quite frank, like it was on the secondary screen for most of the Saturday because I didn't think it happened. It happened. Went back and watched it. Where are the difference makers on Alabama's defense? Like they didn't dominate Vanderbilt along the line of scrimmage like I would have expected. That's a problem if you want to be a national championship caliber football team.
And they're feeling a little bit the loss of some really good defensive ends over the past couple of years, I think. And you have a lot of young talent, but as of right now, I think you're right. The fact that they're not really elite rushing the passer, and then you look, their defensive backs just aren't really particularly great in man coverage. When they get one-on-one opportunities, they're pretty typically, it feels like not typically, but like getting beat far too often for my liking. So I'm comfortable having them there. I look at Georgia, I just say the same things, but flip the sides. I think their offense has very real concerns. That offensive line, their inability to kind of just pound teams, and then missing Brock and Ladd. I know we've talked about it ad nauseum, but it's really kind of rearing itself. Carson Beck just doesn't look the same at all.
Yeah, that there are significant question marks about Georgia on offense, and I think most notably, I kind of trust Carson Beck to figure it out, but I'm also concerned because he hasn't really figured it out without Brock and Ladd. But man, the offensive line, like when you talk Georgia, and when you look at the past Georgia teams that have been some of, if not the best teams in the country, on offense, it started with the offensive line. I just I don't think it's an elite unit this year. And I know they've had some injuries and they're playing with some backups, but we're used to seeing Georgia be able to have the depth on the offensive line to continue to dominate. It's a concern for me with this Georgia team.
This next group of teams, I'm really happy you included Notre Dame. I thought there was no chance you were going to do it. Is Riley Leonard's play scaring me a little bit? Like, yeah, it is. But I also have seen him play at a really high level, which is the frustrating part. I mean, he's throwing the ball low, it feels like a lot. He's just not like hitting open passes, but that's a good rushing attack. I think they have more weapons than, frankly, is being indicated by the fact that Riley Leonard's not playing well enough, but it's great defense. I still think Riley Leonard, like, as much as he's not playing well, he is still moving the ball a little bit. He's run the ball okay. He's been a bit of a compliment to what they're doing. But I do think they belong up in this tier. I think they're one of those more underrated squads in this
I ain't gonna lie to you, Dylan. Notre Dame made it to the tier because I just couldn't figure out the 12th team.
I'm a little surprised you don't have Utah in there, maybe, but like
Utah, I'm gonna put Utah in there when I'm just gonna leave them to a side until I see Cam Rising play for them. But they'll that had a lot more to do with just me looking at the LSU defense, saying I don't trust it. Missouri has just not looked as good as I thought they would, and I'm still think I'm high on Missouri because I think the roster is there. But there was just not a team I could put into it, so it had to be Notre Dame by default. Dill, I want to Clemson. Really explosive offense. Like it's starting to click. It's starting. Like we said this yesterday. Like people were just out on Clemson after they watched that week 1 performance against Georgia. I think that's a different Clemson team we're seeing right now than we've seen against Georgia. Would love to see a rematch happen right now. You look at Texas A&M, potentially an overreaction to what we saw Saturday, absolutely pantsing Missouri. Oh, wow. Dude, tell me what's wrong with this Texas A&M team. The offensive line is playing at a very good level. Connor Wigman, again, maybe an over, but he was awesome. He was in command of the offense, only put the ball in harm's way one time. Pass catchers were making plays, but most notably, Dill, this Texas A&M defense I took some heat from because I put them as a top 5 unit during the offseason. It is starting to look like one of the best defenses in the country. That's what fires me up the most about Texas A&M.
My only concern about A&M, frankly, is if they play one of those really good defensive lines, whether it's a Tennessee, whether it's an Ohio State, whether it's Penn State, like, do they look good enough? Because I think there is an element. Missouri's defensive line, I'm not totally sure what to make of. I was like a little encouraged after the Boston College game. Now I look at Boston College, that is not a good football team. So I think you knock that back a little bit. So is Missouri's defensive line that type of unit that can challenge them like a Notre Dame could, like a Penn State, Ohio State, some of those squads? That's probably my one hang-up because I look at Wigman. He was good. He was also really comfortable in that game. They were running the ball pretty dominantly. When he had some pressure, when he had to go get it out of the fire, if you will, he looked horrible. I mean, you talk about bad quarterback play. He looked atrocious in that.
So I guess the question is, like, what Connor Wigman do you think's here? Do you think the Connor Wigman we saw?
But is that the Connor Wigman, like, can he do that in a big moment? Like what Nico probably couldn't do. Now, Nico, I don't think quite looked as bad as Connor Wigman. He wasn't like turning the ball over, doing anything horrible. But can Connor Wigman at least be serviceable in a big-time game where he is under a lot of duress? Because I think at the end of the day, they're going to have to be. Because I'm not totally convinced that offensive line is like a top 20 unit. If you will.
I mean, I rewatched that game and I was like, this Texas A&M offense. I think your evaluation of Texas A&M is probably pretty dang contingent on what you think of Missouri. Like, there are a lot of people who are out of Missouri. I'm personally not one of those who are out of Missouri. So I'm
Because
inflating
I would
Texas A&M.
probably stick Texas A&M behind these other two teams. I think
Ole Miss would be the one. So I'm probably taking some heat because I have Notre Dame behind Texas A&M, even though they went on the road and beat Texas A&M. But I do think this is a different Texas A&M team that we're seeing. Like, again, I think it's important to realize, like, these teams change in 12 weeks of a season. Like, some teams get better, some teams get hurt and get worse. I talk about a stock that's rising. I think it's Texas A&M. Ole Miss might be the one. The Ole Miss is – everybody wanted to jump on Ole Miss after they lost to Kentucky. A super disappointing loss that they probably shouldn't have lost if you kind of watched that game back. But the big storyline that nobody's talking about is this defense is legit, man. Like, I trust Ole Miss with all the weapons that they have to figure it out on offense, even though it didn't even look that good against South Carolina. It certainly didn't look good against Kentucky. This is an Ole Miss defense that has a legitimate top end front seven in the SEC. People aren't talking about it. This Ole Miss team's dangerous. As I'm talking through it, I might even have Ole Miss a little bit higher in my head because I really do like this team. Let's go back to the teams to watch, the next tiers, the teams that are on the
– feel like there's like a massive demarc, almost like we should leave the middle row with nobody and then put these.
Yeah, I really do think so. Like, I don't feel great about my rankings inside the playoff teams tier, but I feel really good about the what is that, 9 teams that are in that tier. Now you go to the next tier, all of these teams, they don't only have questions like we talked about at the top here, they have legitimate concerns, right? LSU's defense, they just don't have the personnel to play the way Blake Baker wants. Missouri, I thought the offensive line was going to be way better. They got their tail whipped against Texas A&M, and quite frankly, that defense does not look at – we had question marks about the defense. It might be worse than we thought. Oklahoma, disaster offensive line. Utah, look, I might be high on this Utah team if Cam Rising comes back, but I'm just going to leave him here until Cam Rising does come back. Let's talk about the Washington Huskies. That's the team that I want to dive into because this team should be undefeated. They outgained Rutgers 2-1 Friday night, lost the football game. They've been brutal in the red zone. They are a top 15 offense in terms of yards per play, but they're outside of the top 80 in points per game. They have been moving the football at will against these teams, just haven't executed in the red zone. And more importantly, like, my biggest question mark about Washington was, do they have the line of scrimmage play to play in the Big Ten? We're getting our answer. Like, I thought they physically were better than Rutgers along the line of scrimmage 2 weeks ago. And then Michigan certainly didn't blow them off the field on the line of scrimmage. I trust Will Rogers in this Jetfish offense. This Washington team's freaking good, man.
It is good. I mean, I'm kind of with you here. Like, I still look at that roster, and that's where you get, like, they have lost 2 games, so it's not to say like they're Indiana where they're 5-0, and you kind of have, like, they've lost 2 games to teams that aren't the greatest teams in the world. Agreed. Obviously, the win against Michigan's nice, and I think the way they did it, like, their offensive line still was giving up a lot of pressure. They just had some guys making plays on Michigan's secondary that was really struggling. It felt like. I like Washington. I'm not sure I have them as high as you. I look at some of these other teams. Like, I think every game is going to be really kind of close with Washington because I do think, I think teams can run the ball on them. I think good physical teams should be able to run the ball. I look at Michigan, like, they got to the run pretty effectively for good chunks of that game. They're just so inept at quarterback that, like, there's nothing they can do on offense. That's probably my question mark. I still don't think the defensive line is exactly what you need it to be to go challenge teams like, well, I mean, they challenged those teams in their tier, but I don't think they challenged Notre Dame or an Ole Miss or those type of teams yet.
Yes, from a personnel standpoint, like that's why you go back 6 weeks. And I'm looking at this Washington team. I have legitimate concerns. That being said, like, from what I've seen, they've played 2 bully teams along the lines of scrimmage, like Rutgers, Michigan. Those teams are constructed to control the line of scrimmage, and they just flat out didn't against Washington.
Yeah, but I almost feel like that's like a little revisionist history. I mean, those 2 teams have glaring holes at the wide receiver or the passing attacks, let's say, of both of them. I don't think Cal Kamanis is the greatest quarterback. Michigan's quarterback plays probably as bad as you're seeing in the whole Power 4 universe, if you will.
Okay, so let's talk about the teams that I have below Washington. Like Iowa State, Dill, I just flat out don't think the Big 12 is that good. And Iowa State, again, what they're hanging their hat on is a 1-point win against Iowa. I think Washington's going to go on the road to Iowa and win flat out, and I think they're going to win that football game comfortably. Now, you look at USC, I like this USC team in a lot of different ways, but when you have the ineptitude at your offensive tackle position to the extent USC does, it's so hard to win football games. BYU, lump them with Iowa State, like I just don't know how good they are. They're after Washington, like I'm picking Washington to be, I think, every single team in that tier below them.
I get that to an extent. I think Nebraska could be a bit of a problem for them because I do think their offense line is pretty good and they have a quarterback who's really good. I also think they can challenge them up front. I think they can.
Yeah.
Like their defensive line, I think would be a big problem.
Yes,
just like
agreed.
Michigan's was a big problem for Washington.
Yeah.
Again, like I'm not sure Michigan had a great game plan to stop Washington. I know you talked about that in an earlier video. So I look, Washington to me still like man to man. I think there's still some real big question marks. So I look at Nebraska. I even look at a Kansas State, like those type of teams. USC. I don't think they're like. Does Washington win most of those games?
What I would do maybe is push Washington down to the dark horse tier. Like maybe they don't deserve to be on the tier with LSU, Missouri, Oklahoma. I think that could be fair. But it's almost I wanted to come out and make a statement, brother. Like I wanted to say, hey, I think this Washington team is very, very good.
I don't mind it. They are very like they're a really underrated team.
And the other teams that you want to talk about in this dark horse category, like for me, I look at Indiana and just say, like, I just don't know, man. Like,
Kansas State's the one for me. I think you are way down on them.
I agree with that.
Bad game against BYU. That if you watch it, I mean, that just got out of hand so quick. And one worry you have with them is Avery Johnson. He's made some horrible mistakes, and he made a couple of them against that BYU team. But when he's on, that team is very dangerous. I look like they could challenge any of those teams. Yeah, team to watch team.
Totally agree. But like, what's Kansas State's most impressive win? Like they routed Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State looks like they suck. Arizona has massive question marks. Like we were never high in Arizona, and Kansas State beat Arizona bad and kind of shot up the rankings. But like Arizona has not been good. Again, for me, it's like the Big 12, and I think Kansas State.
Yeah, but that's where I think you can't. We're not totally out of the eyeball test woods yet. I think, like again, has Kansas State gotten a chance to go? Like they're going to get their chances when they get to see teams like Utah, the other top of the Big 12, if you will. They haven't seen them yet. They routed Oklahoma State in a way that I think was very, very impressive. So I just look at the personnel. I think their offense can be dangerous. I think their offensive line played great against Oklahoma State. If they do that, they're a team that's really, really tough.
Kansas State has a much higher ceiling than Iowa State. You know what I mean? If Kansas State's best football versus Iowa State's best football, Kansas State wins. That being said, Iowa State's been the far more consistent team, and that matters in the landscape of college football. Like, why did I leave Arkansas out of my top 25? Because I don't know what version of Arkansas. I don't know maybe I'm certainly that, but I don't know what version of Arkansas I'm going to get every single Saturday. Like, at least for Iowa State, like I know what I'm going to get. Like, they're not going to lose the games they shouldn't lose. I don't know if they have the firepower to beat teams like Kansas State, but I know what I'm going to get. Like, Kansas State is kind of in that category of like, I don't know what I'm going to get because you watch that game against BYU, you can't let games just go to heck like that. It's so like so that's excuse me, my take on that. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments. These rankings are seemingly impossible to do. Like the parity's at an all-time high in this sport. A lot of different ways you can stack these teams. Would love to hear from y'all in the comment section. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.